My son said miracles are for fools. Then God showed him one he'll never forget. That moment when your own child spits on everything you taught them about faith, it cuts deeper than any knife could ever reach. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd share. And if you, for even a second, feel like this sounds familiar, I just ask that you leave a like and subscribe, because this story might help someone draw closer to God's love. Amen. My name is Margaret Rose Thompson, and at 73 years old, I thought I'd seen every kind of heartbreak this world could offer. I was wrong. The worst pain doesn't come from strangers or enemies. It comes from the child you raised, the one you prayed over every night, the one you sacrificed everything for, when they look you in the eye and tell you that your faith is foolishness. It was a Tuesday morning in Chicago, the kind where Lake Michigan's wind cuts through your bones no matter how many layers you wear. I was sitting in what used to be my living room, now relegated to the guest area, folding my grandson Tyler's school clothes. The rosary beads clicked softly between my fingers as I worked, a habit I'd developed over 50 years of marriage, widowhood, and single motherhood. Each Hail Mary was a small rebellion against the silence that had settled over this house like dust on forgotten furniture. The hardwood floors still bore the scratches from when Benjamin was 7, dragging his toy truck across the boards while I cooked dinner and hummed, "How Great Thou Art." The same floors I'd scrubbed on my hands and knees to afford when he needed a stable home after his father died. The same floors that now felt cold beneath my slippered feet, even though the house was warm. My phone buzzed against the coffee table. The old wooden one I'd refinished 3 times over the years, each coat of stain marking a different era of hope. Benjamin's name appeared on the screen. My heart lifted for just a moment, the way it always did when he reached out, even though these days his calls were usually requests disguised as conversations. But this wasn't a call. It was a video message. I pressed play with the eager anticipation of a mother who still believed her son might surprise her with kindness. The screen filled with faces I recognized but didn't know. Benjamin's colleagues from the investment firm downtown, gathered in what used to be my kitchen. The marble countertops gleamed under the pendant lights I'd helped him choose when April decided the old laminate wasn't sophisticated enough for their dinner parties. Then I heard his voice. My Benjamin, the little boy who once asked me to teach him the Lord's Prayer because he wanted to talk to Daddy in heaven. "Miracles are for fools," he said, his voice carrying the confident cruelty that success sometimes breeds in good men's hearts. My mom still prays like it actually changes anything. The laughter that followed felt like a physical blow. One of the women, a blonde with sharp cheekbones and sharper words, chimed in, "Let her. She thinks her rosary keeps the house standing." Another voice, male, amused, "She's basically furniture now. Paid off our mortgage when we were drowning, and now she just sits there talking to Jesus all day." The video ended. The phone screen went black, reflecting my face back at me. Hollow cheeks, silver hair pulled back in the practical bun I'd worn since Benjamin's childhood. Brown eyes that had seen too much and forgiven too often. I looked like every grandmother in every church pew across America, unremarkable except for the devastation spreading across my features like spilled wine on white linen. I didn't cry. Not then. Tears felt insufficient for this particular kind of destruction. Instead, I sat in the growing darkness of the Chicago winter afternoon, watching the snow begin to fall against the windows I'd cleaned just that morning. Each flake seemed to mock the warmth I'd tried to maintain in a house that had slowly frozen around me. One dismissive comment at a time, one rolled eye at a time, one, "We don't need to say grace tonight, Mom," at a time. The rosary slipped from my fingers, landing softly on the carpet with the sound of surrender. I thought about the woman I used to be, Margaret Rose Murphy, who'd married her high school sweetheart in a small ceremony at St. Patrick's Cathedral, who'd believed that love and prayer could overcome anything life threw at a family. The woman who'd held her husband's hand as cancer took him too young, whispering the 23rd Psalm until his breathing stopped. The woman who'd worked 3 jobs to keep Benjamin in Catholic school, who'd sold her wedding ring to pay for his college tuition, who'd emptied her retirement account to save this very house when his first marriage fell apart and left him financially ruined. That woman had believed in miracles, had seen them even, had witnessed the way God provided exactly what was needed, exactly when it was needed, over and over again, through 40 years of raising a son alone in a world that wasn't kind to single mothers or women of faith. But that woman had never imagined she'd live to see her son mock her beliefs to entertain strangers in the kitchen she'd helped him afford. Hours passed. The house filled with the familiar sounds of a family that no longer included me. Benjamin's key in the front door, April's heels clicking across the entryway, Tyler's backpack hitting the floor with the careless abandon of childhood. Dinner preparations began without me, as they had for months now. The microwave hummed with frozen meals, while the kitchen I'd once filled with the smell of homemade bread and Sunday roasts remained largely unused. I remained in my chair, holding the phone like evidence of a crime I couldn't quite name. Betrayal felt too small a word. This was something deeper. The systematic erasure of a person who had shaped every comfortable corner of their lives, but was now inconvenient to acknowledge. Tyler appeared in the doorway, all gangly limbs and earnest eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses that made him look older than his 12 years. He was the only one who still said, "God bless you," when someone sneezed. The only one who asked if I wanted to pray together before meals. In him, I could still see traces of the faith I'd planted, still growing despite the hostile environment his parents had created. "Grandma? Are you okay? You missed dinner." His concern was genuine, unmarked by the casual cruelty that had infected his parents' treatment of me. I managed a smile that felt like lifting weights. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just thinking." About what? About how love could be perverted into obligation. About how sacrifice could be reframed as manipulation. About how a lifetime of faithfulness could be reduced to furniture that occasionally needed dusting. About prayers, I said instead. About how God sometimes answers them in ways we don't expect. Tyler nodded with the solemnity of a child who'd learned early that adults carried burdens he couldn't yet understand. He kissed my forehead, a gesture his father had abandoned years ago, and disappeared back into the warmth of a house that had grown cold around me. That night, lying in the guest bedroom that had become my permanent residence, I stared at the crucifix on the wall, the one April had asked me to remove from the hallway because it clashed with the aesthetic. The moonlight streaming through the window cast shadows across Christ's face, and for the first time in months, I felt truly seen. Not by my family, not by the people I'd devoted my life to serving and supporting and loving despite their growing indifference, but by the God who'd carried me through widowhood and single motherhood and the slow erosion of dignity that came with aging in a youth-obsessed world. The God who'd watched me give and give and give until I had nothing left but my faith, and then watched that faith be mocked by the very people who'd benefited from its fruits. I closed my eyes and whispered the prayer that had sustained me through every crisis of the past 50 years. "Dear Jesus, help me know what to do." In the silence that followed, something shifted, not audibly, but in the space between my heartbeats, where God's voice had always been clearest. This wasn't about them anymore. This wasn't about being appreciated or acknowledged or loved in return. This was about remembering who I was before I became their safety net, before I became convenient, before I became furniture. This was about remembering that I was Margaret Rose Thompson, daughter of the Most High God, and that my worth had never been dependent on their approval. The snow continued to fall outside my window, each flake unique and beautiful and temporary. Like miracles, I thought. Like the one that was about to begin. The morning after Benjamin's video, I woke before dawn as I had every day for the past 40 years. Old habits die hard, especially when they're carved from necessity and tempered by love. But instead of rising immediately to start breakfast for a family that barely acknowledged my presence, I lay still in the darkness, letting memories wash over me like waves against a weathered shore. I remembered the night Benjamin was born, July 15th, 1981. His father, Michael, had been deployed overseas with the Navy, and I'd labored alone in the stark hospital room, gripping my rosary until the beads left impressions in my palm. When Benjamin finally arrived, all 8 pounds of him, screaming with the indignation of interrupted comfort, I'd whispered my first prayer over his tiny head. "Lord, help me raise this boy to know you." For 18 years, I thought I'd succeeded. The memories came in fragments, each one sharp enough to cut. Benjamin at age 5, kneeling beside his bed in Superman pajamas, hands clasped as he repeated the prayers I'd taught him. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. His voice had been so earnest, so pure, that I'd often found myself crying tears of gratitude that God had entrusted me with this precious soul. When Michael died 6 months later, brain cancer, swift and merciless, Benjamin had asked me why God would take his daddy away. I'd held him close, breathing in the scent of his strawberry shampoo, and told him that sometimes God needed the best people to help him in heaven. Benjamin had nodded solemnly and asked if we could pray for Daddy every night. We did, for 7 years, until he decided prayers were babyish. The sacrifices had started small, giving up my morning coffee so Benjamin could have lunch money, wearing the same winter coat for 5 years so he could play Little League, working double shifts at the diner while he slept, coming home exhausted but grateful when I found his homework completed and left on the kitchen table with a crayon drawing that said, "I love you, Mommy." But as he grew older, the sacrifices grew larger and more complex. When he was 15 and wanted to attend a summer science camp that cost more than I made in 3 months, I'd sold my grandmother's pearl necklace, the only valuable thing I owned. When he needed a car for his senior year, I'd taken out a loan against the house that took me 6 years to pay off. College had nearly broken me financially, but I'd found a way. I'd found 3 ways, actually: cleaning offices at night, watching neighbors' children on weekends, and tutoring adult literacy students at the community center. Benjamin had gotten into Northwestern University, and I'd cried with pride at his acceptance letter. When the financial aid fell short by $15,000, I'd cashed out my small retirement fund and paid the penalties without hesitation. Education is the one thing no one can take away from you, I'd told him as we toured the campus together. He'd been embarrassed by my secondhand dress and practical shoes, but I'd been too overwhelmed by gratitude to notice his discomfort. My son was going to have opportunities I'd never dreamed of. He was going to make something of himself, and he had. Benjamin graduated summa cum laude with a degree in finance, landed a prestigious job at Morrison & Associates downtown, and married a beautiful woman from a wealthy family. I'd been so proud, so grateful to God for answering my decades of prayers. My sacrifices had borne fruit beyond my wildest imagination. The irony wasn't lost on me now, lying in the pre-dawn darkness. The very success I'd enabled had become the source of my diminishment in his eyes. I rose and made my way to the kitchen, muscle memory guiding me through the familiar motions of making coffee. The house was silent, except for the gentle hum of expensive appliances. The Sub-Zero refrigerator Benjamin had insisted on, the commercial-grade range that April used maybe twice a month, the wine cooler that held bottles worth more than my monthly Social Security check. Standing at the granite island I'd helped them afford, I let myself remember the conversation that had changed everything. It was 2 years ago, just after Benjamin's promotion to senior partner. He'd come home flushed with success and wine from the celebration dinner, finding me in the living room reading my Bible before bed. "Mom, we need to talk," he'd said, settling into the leather chair across from me. His tone had been gentle but firm, the way you'd speak to a child about a difficult topic. April and I have been discussing our living situation. I'd marked my place in Psalms and given him my full attention, assuming he wanted to share good news about his promotion. "We're thinking it might be time for you to consider other options," he'd continued. "You know, senior living communities. Places where you'd have people your own age to socialize with." The words had hit me like ice water. "Other options? Don't get me wrong, Mom. We're grateful for everything you've done. The help with the down payment, watching Tyler when he was little, all of it. But now that we're financially stable, we think it might be healthy for everyone if you had your own space." I'd stared at him, this man I'd shaped from infancy, and seen a stranger. "This is my home, Benjamin. I've lived here for 8 years. I helped you buy it. I know, and we appreciate that. But legally the house is in our names, and April feels like she can't really make it her own with—" He'd gestured vaguely in my direction. "With me here. With anyone here. It's not personal, Mom. It's just, we're ready to be a nuclear family. You understand, right?" I'd understood perfectly. I'd understood that my usefulness had expired. that the woman who'd sacrificed her golden years to help them achieve theirs was now an inconvenience to be managed. But I'd also understood something else in that moment, something that had taken me 2 years to fully comprehend. I'd understood that I had choices, that I wasn't powerless simply because I was older, simply because I was a woman, simply because I'd prioritized love over legal protections. The conversation had ended with a compromise. I would move to the guest room, pay rent to help with household expenses, and transition gradually to independent living. April had seemed satisfied with this arrangement. Benjamin had seemed relieved, and I had seemed compliant. But compliance and surrender are not the same thing. Now, sipping my coffee in the kitchen where I'd once felt welcome, I thought about all the ways I'd continued to serve this family even after being demoted from mother to tenant. I'd paid for Tyler's private school tuition when Benjamin's bonus was smaller than expected. I'd covered their mortgage payments twice when the stock market dipped and Benjamin's commissions suffered. I'd watched Tyler every day after school, helping with homework and providing the stability his parents were too busy to offer. Just last month, when April had wanted to redecorate the master bedroom, I'd quietly transferred $5,000 to their account. When Benjamin's car needed expensive repairs, I'd handled it without being asked. When they'd planned their anniversary trip to Europe, I'd not only paid for Tyler's care, but had also surprised them with first-class upgrades. Not once had they said thank you. Not once had they acknowledged that their comfortable lifestyle was subsidized by the woman they'd relegated to a guest room and casual dismissal. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my bank statements, calculating the total I'd given them over the past 2 years alone. $47,000. Nearly my entire inheritance from my mother's estate, plus a substantial portion of my Social Security income. $47,000 from a woman they saw as furniture. The kitchen began to brighten with the first hints of dawn, and I heard stirring upstairs. Soon, April would come down in her silk robe, expecting coffee to be ready and breakfast options laid out. Benjamin would follow, scrolling through his phone and making mental notes about his day while I bustled around like an unpaid housekeeper. Tyler would be last, sleepy and sweet, probably forgetting his lunch money again. I would slip a $5 bill into his backpack, knowing his parents gave him barely enough for the school's overpriced cafeteria food. But not today. Today, I made coffee only for myself. I sat at the breakfast bar with my Bible open to Ecclesiastes, reading about seasons and times for all things. There is a time to plant and a time to harvest, a time to give and a time to refrain from giving, a time to be silent and a time to speak. When April appeared 20 minutes later, she found me reading peacefully, my hands wrapped around my coffee mug like a prayer. "Where's breakfast?" she asked, opening the refrigerator with the expectation of finding her usual options prepared and waiting. "I'm not sure," I replied without looking up from my Bible. "Where did you put it?" She turned to stare at me, confusion creasing her perfectly maintained forehead. "What do you mean?" "I mean I didn't make breakfast this morning. I was reading about the virtues of self-reliance." Benjamin chose that moment to enter the kitchen, already dressed in his $1,000 suit, checking his Rolex with the impatience of a man who expected the world to align with his schedule. "Mom, where's the coffee?" he asked, pouring himself orange juice from the pitcher I hadn't refilled. "In the coffee maker," I said simply, "but it's cold. You always have fresh coffee ready." I looked up from my Bible then, meeting his eyes with a calm I hadn't felt in years. "I made coffee for myself this morning. If you'd like fresh coffee, the machine is right there." Something shifted in the air between us. Benjamin and April exchanged glances that I wasn't supposed to catch, but I did. The look that said, "She's being difficult." The look that said, "We'll deal with this later." But I wasn't being difficult. I was being deliberate. As I climbed the stairs to my room, I heard April's sharp whisper, "What's gotten into her?" I smiled as I closed my door. What had gotten into me was the same thing that had sustained me through 40 years of single motherhood. Faith in a God who sees everything and forgets nothing, and the growing certainty that sometimes miracles begin with a simple word that too many women never learn to say, no. The days following my small rebellion in the kitchen passed like scenes from a play I no longer wanted to star in. Benjamin and April moved around me with the careful politeness reserved for unstable relatives, speaking in measured tones, avoiding direct eye contact, discussing my behavior in whispered conversations they thought I couldn't hear. I could hear everything. When you become invisible to people, they forget that invisible doesn't mean deaf. She's acting strange, April told her sister during their daily phone call, her voice drifting up through the heating vents from the kitchen below. Yesterday, she didn't do the laundry. She just sat there reading that old Bible all morning. Maybe she's getting dementia, her sister suggested. My neighbor's mother started acting weird before they had to put her in a home. A home. The word hung in the air like a threat, and I understood that my small act of self-preservation had been interpreted as evidence of declining mental faculties. Because surely, a woman of my age wouldn't choose to stop serving others unless something was wrong with her mind. The irony was suffocating. For 2 years, I'd watched them live in luxury funded by my sacrifices while treating me like an unwanted houseguest. But the moment I stopped anticipating their every need, I became the problem that needed solving. I began to notice things I'd been too busy to see before. How April never asked about my day, my health, or my feelings, but could spend 20 minutes describing the drama surrounding her yoga instructor's divorce. How Benjamin discussed his work challenges at dinner as if I weren't present, seeking April's input while my decades of life experience went unacknowledged. How they planned family activities, weekend trips, restaurant reservations, holiday celebrations, without including me unless they needed a babysitter. It was Tyler who broke my heart the most, because he was the only one who seemed to notice my growing silence. "Grandma, are you sad?" he asked one afternoon, finding me in the sunroom I'd retreated to after lunch. The late October light streamed through the windows I'd paid to have replaced last spring, casting golden patterns across the hardwood floors I'd helped refinish the year before. I was holding my rosary, not praying exactly, but letting the familiar beads comfort my fingers while my mind wandered through memories of better times. Times when this house had felt like home instead of a prison with lovely furniture. "Why would you think I'm sad, sweetheart?" I asked, making room for him on the window seat cushions I'd sewn myself. Tyler shrugged with the eloquence of a 12-year-old trying to articulate complex emotions. "You don't sing anymore. You used to sing while you cooked, remember? And you don't laugh at Dad's jokes." I almost smiled at that. Benjamin rarely told jokes anymore. And when he did, they were usually cruel observations about other people's misfortunes disguised as humor. The kind of sophisticated cynicism that passed for wit in his social circle. "Sometimes adults go through quiet periods," I said carefully. "Like when you're reading a really important book and you need to concentrate." "What book are you reading?" "The book of my life. I'm trying to figure out how the story should end." He nodded as if this made perfect sense, then leaned against my shoulder with the trust that children reserve for the people who've never let them down. "I hope it has a happy ending, Grandma. You deserve one." Out of the mouths of babes. This child, who'd absorbed more wisdom in 12 years than his parents had managed in decades, could see what they refused to acknowledge, that I was a person worthy of happiness, not just a resource to be managed. That evening brought another revelation, this one delivered through the thin walls of a house that had never been designed for multi-generational living. I was in my room, trying to lose myself in evening prayers, when I heard Benjamin and April's voices from their bedroom down the hall. "We need to do something about your mother," April said. Her tone was crisp, businesslike, the same one she used when planning charity galas or organizing Tyler's schedule. "She's becoming a liability." "What do you mean?" Benjamin's voice carried the wariness of a man who'd learned to navigate his wife's moods carefully. "I mean, she's not contributing anymore. She just sits around all day reading that book and staring out windows. And last week, when I asked her to pick up the dry cleaning, she said she was unavailable. Unavailable, like she has somewhere important to be." I pressed my ear closer to the wall, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. "She's 73, April. Maybe she's tired." "Tired of what?" "She doesn't work. She doesn't have responsibilities. All we ask is that she help around the house in exchange for room and board." Room and board. As if I were a teenager earning my keep through chores instead of the woman who'd made their comfortable life possible. "And another thing," April continued, warming to her subject. "I found out she's been giving Tyler money. $5 here, $10 there. He doesn't need it. We give him plenty of allowance. She's undermining our parenting. My hands clenched around my rosary beads. Those small gifts to Tyler weren't undermining anything. They were gestures of love from a grandmother who remembered what it felt like to want something simple and be told the family couldn't afford it. Tyler never asked for the money. I gave it because I could, because seeing his face light up with gratitude reminded me that kindness still mattered in this world. Maybe we should look into those senior living places again, April suggested. The nice ones. We could frame it as giving her more independence, more people her own age to socialize with. I don't know, Benjamin said. And for a moment, my heart lifted with hope that my son might still have some protective instinct where his mother was concerned. It seems cruel to kick her out after everything she's done for us. We wouldn't be kicking her out. We'd be helping her transition to the next phase of her life. And honestly, Ben, I don't think I can take much more of this tension. Every time I walk into a room, I feel like she's judging me. I almost laughed at that. April felt judged by me? The woman who'd spent 2 years making me feel like an intruder in my own life felt uncomfortable under my gaze? Let me think about it, Benjamin said finally. Maybe after the holidays. We don't want to disrupt Tyler's routine right now. The holidays. 8 weeks away. I had 8 weeks before they would begin actively planning my removal from the home I'd helped them build, the family I'd sacrificed everything to support. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around me. Every creak and sigh of the old bones felt like a countdown, marking time until I would be packaged up and shipped off to some sterile facility where old women went to die quietly and conveniently. But as the hours passed and dawn approached, something hardened inside me. Not bitterness exactly, but clarity. The same clarity that had carried me through Michael's death, through Benjamin's childhood, through decades of making impossible choices with insufficient resources. I thought about the women in my Bible study group, the ones who'd disappeared over the years into assisted living facilities because their families decided they were too much trouble. Martha, who'd raised 6 children and lost her home when her son decided she was better off in professional care. Dorothy, who'd been a teacher for 40 years and ended up in a nursing home because her daughter-in-law found her disruptive to their household harmony. These weren't women who'd been neglectful or abusive mothers. They were women who'd given everything and received exile in return. Women whose children had learned to see them as burdens rather than blessings, problems to be solved rather than people to be cherished. I wouldn't become one of them. Not without a fight. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in 2 years. I got dressed in my best outfit, the navy blue dress I'd worn to Benjamin's wedding, the one that still fit perfectly and made me feel elegant instead of elderly. I put on the pearl earrings Michael had given me for our 10th anniversary, the ones I'd managed not to sell during all those lean years. I applied lipstick and combed my silver hair into a style that belonged in boardrooms rather than breakfast nooks. Then I went downstairs and announced that I would be out for the day. "Where are you going?" April asked, looking up from her phone with barely concealed irritation. "I have appointments," I said calmly. "What kind of appointments? Do you need a ride?" The concern in her voice was performative, the kind of solicitousness she displayed when Tyler was watching. But Tyler had already left for school, and we both knew she was asking more from nosiness than genuine care. "Personal business," I replied. "I'll be back this evening." I walked out of that house with more purpose than I'd felt in months. My purse containing not just my identification and credit cards, but also every bank statement, investment summary, and legal document that proved exactly how much I'd contributed to their prosperity. It was time to have some conversations. Time to understand my options. Time to remember that being 73 didn't mean being powerless. And time to discover exactly what kind of miracle God had in mind for a woman who'd finally learned to stop enabling her own diminishment. The October wind cut through my coat as I walked to my car, but I felt warmer than I had in years. Because for the first time in decades, I wasn't going somewhere to give. I was going somewhere to take back what was mine, starting with my dignity, starting with my choices, starting with the radical notion that my remaining years belonged to me. Not to the people who'd grown comfortable thinking they could manage my life better than I could. The road ahead stretched before me like a promise, and I pressed the accelerator with the satisfaction of a woman who'd finally remembered that she knew how to drive her own life. My first stop was the law office of Patricia Williams, a woman I'd met at St. Mary's during one of the rare Sundays I still felt welcome to attend Mass without April's pointed comments about taking up the whole morning. Patricia specialized in elder law, and more importantly, she understood what it meant to be a woman who'd spent her life taking care of everyone except herself. The office was located in a converted brownstone near downtown Chicago, the kind of building that whispered respectability without shouting wealth. Patricia herself was around my age. With silver hair she wore short and practical, and eyes that held the particular kindness that comes from having fought battles most people never knew existed. "Margaret," she said, rising from behind a desk covered with files that represented other women's struggles for dignity in their golden years. "I was wondering when you'd call." We'd spoken briefly after Mass several months ago, when I'd mentioned my living situation in passing. She'd handed me her card with a meaningful look and said, "If you ever need to talk about your options, call me." I'd tucked the card away, never imagining I'd have the courage to use it. Now, sitting across from her in a chair that faced the window overlooking the street, I pulled out my folder of documents and spread them across her desk like evidence in a trial. "I need to understand what I can and cannot do," I said without preamble. "They think they're going to put me in a home after the holidays." Patricia's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes that told me she'd heard this story before. "Tell me everything, Margaret. Start from the beginning." For the next hour, I laid out the financial reality of my situation, how I'd contributed $63,000 to Benjamin and April's down payment, how I'd paid for Tyler's private school tuition for 3 years running, how I'd covered their mortgage payments twice, handled car repairs, funded home improvements, and subsidized their lifestyle while being treated like an inconvenient relative. Patricia took notes with the methodical precision of someone building a case, asking questions that illuminated aspects of my situation I hadn't fully considered. "These payments you made to their mortgage company," she said, reviewing my bank statements. "Do you have documentation showing these came from your account?" "Everyone. Online transfers, check copies, bank statements, and the down payment contribution. Was this documented as a loan or a gift?" I hesitated. At the time, Benjamin said it was an investment in our family's future. He promised I'd always have a home with them. But nothing in writing? No, I trusted him. He's my son. Patricia nodded with the weary understanding of someone who'd watched family trust become financial vulnerability too many times. "Margaret, legally speaking, your son is under no obligation to provide you with housing or care. But financially speaking, you have more power than you realize." She explained concepts I'd never considered: constructive trusts, unjust enrichment, the legal principle that prevented people from benefiting unfairly from others' contributions. More importantly, she explained something that had never occurred to me: that I could stop giving. "You're not obligated to continue subsidizing their lifestyle," she said gently. "In fact, given what you've told me about their plans to move you to assisted living, I'd recommend you stop all financial contributions immediately." "But what about Tyler? His tuition is due next month." "Tyler is not your financial responsibility, Margaret. He's theirs. If they can't afford his private school tuition without your help, perhaps they should consider public education or reducing their own expenses." The idea felt revolutionary and terrifying. For so many years, I'd been the family's financial safety net, stepping in whenever they faced unexpected expenses or wanted something beyond their means. The thought of saying no felt like abandoning my role as mother and grandmother. But as Patricia explained my options, I began to understand that enabling their irresponsibility wasn't love. It was fear. Fear that they'd reject me if I stopped being useful. Fear that I'd lose Tyler if I didn't continue buying my place in his life. Fear that admitting I deserved better treatment would somehow make me a bad Christian. "There's something else," Patricia said, leaning forward with the intensity of someone delivering crucial information. "Your contributions to their household expenses, combined with your length of residence, may have given you tenant rights. They can't simply evict you without proper notice and legal proceedings." The knowledge felt like armor I didn't know I'd been entitled to wear. My second stop was First National Bank, where I'd maintained accounts for over 30 years. James Morrison, the branch manager, had helped me navigate Michael's death benefits, Benjamin's college loans, and every major financial decision of my adult life. He greeted me with the warm familiarity of someone who'd witnessed my journey from young widow to successful survivor. "Mrs. Thompson, how wonderful to see you. How can I help you today?" I handed him a list I'd prepared during the drive from Patricia's office. "I need to make some changes to my accounts. Close the automatic transfers to my son's mortgage company. Remove him as a beneficiary on my savings accounts. Set up a new checking account that only I have access to." James's eyebrows rose slightly, but his professional demeanor never wavered. "Of course. May I ask if there's been some kind of family emergency?" "You could say that. I've had an emergency of clarity." As we worked through the paperwork, I felt each signature liberating another piece of my financial autonomy. Benjamin had grown comfortable with my money flowing toward him like water finding its level. He'd started to expect it, to plan around it, to treat my resources as family resources while treating me like a family burden. That ended today. "Mrs. Thompson," James said as we concluded our business, "I hope you don't mind me saying this, but in all my years of banking, I've seen too many older adults lose control of their finances to well-meaning family members. What you're doing today, maintaining your independence, it's smart." I left the bank feeling lighter than I had in months, despite the gravity of what I'd set in motion. The automatic payment that had covered half of Benjamin and April's mortgage for the past 2 years would stop at the end of the month. The joint account they used for household expenses, which mysteriously always seemed to include April's spa treatments and Benjamin's golf club fees, would be closed by Friday. They would discover my financial independence the same way I'd discovered their plans for my future. Suddenly, and without preparation. The confrontation came sooner than I'd expected. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner. Old habits die hard, and Tyler needed to eat regardless of the adult drama swirling around him. When Benjamin burst through the front door with the controlled fury of a man who'd received unwelcome news from his mortgage company. "Mom!" His voice carried the sharp edge of panic disguised as authority. "We need to talk. Now." April appeared from the living room, her face flushed with the kind of anger that comes from having one's assumptions shattered. "Do you know what you've done? Do you have any idea what you've done?" I continued chopping vegetables for the pot roast I'd planned, my movements deliberate and calm. "I've taken control of my own finances. I believe that's called being a responsible adult." "Responsible?" Benjamin's voice cracked like an adolescent's. "You've put our house in jeopardy. The mortgage payment is due next week, and suddenly the bank is telling us there's no automatic transfer scheduled." "That's correct." "Mom, you can't just stop paying without warning us." I set down my knife and turned to face them, these two people who'd grown so comfortable with my subsidies that they'd forgotten I was a person rather than a resource. "Benjamin, I wasn't paying your mortgage. I was paying half your mortgage while being treated like an unwanted guest in the home I helped you afford. That arrangement no longer serves my interests." "Your interests?" April's voice reached a pitch that probably disturbed dogs 3 blocks away. "What about Tyler's interests? What about our family's stability?" "Tyler's stability is your responsibility as his parents, not mine as his grandmother. And as for family stability, perhaps you should have considered that before planning to ship me off to a nursing home." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the wall clock ticking in the next room. Benjamin and April exchanged the kind of look that passes between conspirators who've been caught. "How did you—" Benjamin started, then stopped, realizing that admitting to the conversation I'd overheard would only make things worse. "The walls in this house are thin," I said calmly, "and you've never been as quiet as you think you are." Tyler chose that moment to walk into the kitchen, his backpack slung over one shoulder and his homework in his free hand. He took in the scene with the quick assessment of a child who'd learned to read adult tension, his eyes moving from his father's red face to his mother's furious expression to my composed stillness. "Is everything okay?" he asked, and the innocence in his voice made the adult's behavior seem even more shameful. "Everything's fine, sweetheart," I said, resuming my dinner preparations. "Why don't you start your homework at the kitchen table while I finish cooking?" Benjamin and April retreated to the living room, where their urgent whispers created a soundtrack of panic and recrimination. I could catch fragments of their conversation. Phrases like lawyer, elder abuse, and forcing our hand that told me they were scrambling to find some way to regain control of a situation that had slipped completely out of their grasp. Tyler worked on his math homework while I cooked, occasionally looking up to smile at me with the uncomplicated affection that had become increasingly rare in this house. He had no idea that his tuition would go unpaid next month, that his parents were facing their first taste of financial consequences, that the grandmother he loved was finally learning to love herself enough to say no. "Grandma," he said as I placed a plate of pot roast and vegetables in front of him, "are you and Dad fighting?" I sat down beside him with my own plate, considering how to answer honestly without burdening him with adult problems. "Sometimes, Tyler, people have to make difficult decisions about what's best for their lives. Your father and I disagree about some of those decisions. Are you going to leave?" The question hung in the air like a prayer, carrying all the weight of a child's fear of abandonment. I reached over and squeezed his hand. "I'm not going anywhere unless I choose to go somewhere. And if I ever do choose to go somewhere else, it will be because I've found a place where I can be happy, not because anyone made me leave." He nodded solemnly, then brightened. "Could I visit you? If you went somewhere else?" "Of course you could. Grandmas and grandsons always find ways to spend time together." From the living room came the sound of April's voice raised in frustration, and Benjamin's responses growing increasingly desperate. They were discovering what I'd learned over the past 2 years, that depending on someone else's generosity while treating them poorly is an ultimately unsustainable strategy. As Tyler and I finished our dinner in peaceful companionship, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: the satisfaction of knowing that my actions were aligned with my values. I wasn't being vindictive or cruel. I was simply refusing to enable their disrespect any longer. The miracle wasn't in some dramatic transformation or divine intervention. The miracle was in the radical act of an elderly woman deciding that she deserved to be treated with dignity and having the courage to enforce that standard. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new attempts at manipulation, new arguments about responsibility and family loyalty. But tonight, eating dinner with my grandson while his parents panicked about consequences they'd never had to face, I felt something I'd almost forgotten how to feel: proud of myself. And for the first time in years, that felt like enough. The days following my financial independence felt like learning to breathe after years of holding my breath. Each morning, I woke with the startling realization that I could make choices, real choices, about how to spend my time, my energy, and my money. For the first time in decades, I said no. Not once, but repeatedly, with the growing confidence of a woman rediscovering her own voice. When April asked me to pick up her dry cleaning, I said, "I have other plans today." When Benjamin suggested I might want to reconsider my banking decisions, I said, "I've considered them carefully, and I'm satisfied with my choices." When they hinted that Tyler's private school tuition was due and they were having temporary cash flow issues, I said, "That sounds like something you'll need to work out together." The power in these simple refusals was intoxicating. For so long, I'd believed that being a good mother and grandmother meant saying yes to everything, sacrificing my own needs to meet theirs, enabling their poor decisions in the name of family love. But I was beginning to understand that real love sometimes requires boundaries, and that respect must be earned rather than assumed. The atmosphere in the house grew thick with tension and unspoken accusations. Benjamin and April moved around me with the careful hostility of people who'd lost control of a situation they'd thought they managed perfectly. Their whispered conversations stopped abruptly when I entered a room. Their phone calls to friends and family members, searching for alternative sources of funding or moral support for their position, were conducted behind closed doors. But Tyler remained unchanged in his affection, and that gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. On Friday afternoon, exactly 1 week after my visit to Patricia Williams, I made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of staying home to witness another evening of barely concealed family drama, I drove to St. Mary's for evening mass. I hadn't attended evening services in over a year, not since April had made pointed comments about how my religious schedule interfered with family dinner time and Tyler's homework routine. But sitting in the familiar wooden pew, surrounded by the quiet devotion of other congregants. I felt something I'd almost forgotten: peace. Father Martinez delivered a homily about the woman caught in adultery, specifically focusing on Jesus' words to her accusers: "Let anyone among you who is without sin cast the first stone." But it wasn't the familiar message about forgiveness that struck me most deeply. It was what Jesus said to the woman after her accusers had departed: "Go, and sin no more. Go, and sin no more." Not stay and accept continued punishment. Not remain in a situation that diminishes your dignity, because forgiveness requires self-sacrifice. Go, move forward, change your circumstances. After Mass, I found myself in conversation with Helen Rodriguez, a widow about my age who'd been attending St. Mary's for decades. We'd exchanged pleasantries over the years, but had never had a real conversation, partly because I'd always been hurrying home to prepare dinner or help with Tyler's homework. "Margaret, isn't it?" she said as we stood in the parking lot, both of us seemingly reluctant to return to whatever waited for us at home. "You look wonderful tonight. Different somehow." "Thank you, Helen. I feel different." She studied my face with the perceptive eyes of a woman who'd navigated her own share of life's complications. "Would you like to get coffee? There's a little place around the corner that stays open late." I almost said no out of habit, already formulating excuses about needing to get home. Then I stopped myself. Home to what? To Benjamin and April's cold shoulders and whispered resentments? To another evening of walking on eggshells in a house where I'd never been welcome despite paying for the privilege of staying there? "I'd love to," I said, and meant it. The coffee shop was warm and welcoming, filled with the kind of eclectic furniture and soft lighting that invited conversation rather than hurried consumption. Helen and I found a corner table near the window, where we could watch the Friday evening foot traffic while we talked. "So," Helen said after we'd settled in with our drinks, "what's making you look so radiant? And don't tell me it's a new face cream, because I've tried them all." I laughed, surprising myself with the sound. When was the last time I'd laughed genuinely? When was the last time someone had asked about my life with real curiosity rather than perfunctory politeness? "I've been making some changes," I said carefully, unsure how much to share with someone who was still essentially a stranger. "Good changes, I hope? Necessary changes. It's remarkable how liberating it can be to finally say no to people who've grown comfortable taking advantage of your generosity." Helen nodded with the understanding of someone who'd learned similar lessons. "Family? My son and daughter-in-law. They've been taking me for granted. For years. I finally decided to stop enabling their behavior." "Good for you." Helen's response was immediate and wholehearted. "I went through something similar with my daughter about 5 years ago. She'd gotten into the habit of treating me like a combination ATM and babysitting service while making me feel like an imposition in my own life. What did you do?" "I moved out, got my own apartment, set boundaries, stopped being available whenever she needed something but had no time for me when I needed her. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but also the most necessary." The idea of moving out hadn't seriously occurred to me, despite Benjamin and April's hints about assisted living. I'd been so focused on defending my right to stay that I hadn't considered the possibility of choosing to leave. "Do you regret it?" "Not for a moment. Our relationship is better now than it's been in years, because it's based on mutual respect instead of convenient exploitation. She knows I love her, but she also knows I won't tolerate being treated poorly. It's made both of us better people." We talked for 2 hours, sharing stories about the challenges of aging in a culture that valued youth, the complexity of relationships with adult children who'd learned to see their parents as resources rather than people, and the surprising freedom that came with finally putting your own needs on equal footing with everyone else's. When I finally arrived home, the house was dark except for the porch light I'd left on for myself. Benjamin and April had apparently given up waiting for me to return and explain my absence. Tyler's bedroom light was off, suggesting he'd managed his Friday evening routine without requiring my assistance. I moved through the quiet rooms with a sense of ownership I hadn't felt in months. This was still my home, regardless of whose names appeared on the deed. I'd earned my place here through years of financial contribution and emotional investment, and I wouldn't be shamed into feeling like an intruder. Saturday morning brought an unexpected confrontation. When I announced my intention to spend the day in the city, visiting museums and galleries I hadn't seen in years. Alone? April asked, as if the concept of a 73-year-old woman navigating Chicago independently was inherently dangerous. Yes, alone. I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself. But what if something happens? What if you get confused or lost? The implication stung, but I recognized it for what it was, an attempt to reinforce the narrative that I was becoming incapable of independent living. If they could convince me and themselves that I needed constant supervision, then their plans for assisted living would seem reasonable rather than cruel. April, I raised a child in this city, worked multiple jobs, managed household finances, and navigated every crisis life threw at me for 40 years. I think I can handle a day at the Art Institute. Benjamin emerged from the living room, apparently drawn by the sound of tension. Mom, April's just concerned about your safety. There's no need to get defensive. I'm not defensive. I'm decisive. There's a difference. I left them standing in the kitchen, their mouths slightly open as if they couldn't quite process this version of me, the one who made her own plans and didn't seek their permission or approval. The day in the city was revelatory. I hadn't realized how small my world had become, how completely I'd allowed my life to revolve around Benjamin and April's schedules and preferences. Walking through the galleries at the Art Institute, I felt my soul expanding like a flower that had been kept in shade too long, finally reaching sunlight. I had lunch at a small cafe near Lincoln Park, reading a novel I'd bought on impulse at the museum gift shop. The protagonist was a woman my age who'd decided to travel the world after her husband's death, despite her children's objections that she was too old for such adventures. The parallels to my own situation weren't lost on me. On the train ride home, I made a mental list of things I wanted to do, places I wanted to see, experiences I'd been postponing because they didn't fit into my family's expectations of appropriate behavior for a woman my age. The list was longer than I'd expected, filled with possibilities I'd forgotten I was entitled to pursue. When I walked through the front door that evening, I found Benjamin, April, and Tyler in the living room engaged in what was clearly a planned intervention. "Mom," Benjamin said with the forced calm of someone who'd rehearsed his words, "we've been talking, and we think it might be time to discuss some practical arrangements for your future." I remained standing in the doorway, my purse still in my hand, studying their faces. Benjamin looked uncomfortable but determined. April's expression was a mixture of false concern and barely concealed impatience. Tyler appeared confused and worried, clearly uncertain about what was happening but sensing its importance. "What kind of arrangements?" I asked, though I already knew. "Well," April said, taking the lead with the enthusiasm of someone finally able to address a long-standing problem. "We've been researching some really lovely senior communities, places where you'd have your own space, but also access to activities and healthcare and people your own age." "I see. And what prompted this sudden concern for my social life?" "It's not sudden," Benjamin protested. "We've been worried about you for months. Your behavior has been erratic. Refusing to help with household tasks, disappearing for hours without explanation, making impulsive financial decisions." I looked at my son, this man I'd raised to be honorable and compassionate, and saw a stranger who'd learned to justify selfishness as concern. "Benjamin, the only erratic thing about my behavior is that I've finally stopped enabling yours. I'm not refusing to help with household tasks. I'm refusing to be your unpaid domestic staff. I'm not disappearing. I'm living my life. And I'm not making impulsive financial decisions. I'm making informed choices about my own money." "But Mom," he said, and for a moment his voice carried an echo of the little boy who'd once needed my protection. "We're a family. We're supposed to take care of each other." "You're absolutely right," I said, setting down my purse and finally entering the room fully. "We are supposed to take care of each other, all of each other, including me." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken truths and uncomfortable realizations. Tyler was the first to speak, his young voice cutting through the adult tension with devastating clarity. "Are you sending Grandma away?" Benjamin and April exchanged glances before April answered with false brightness. "We're not sending her anywhere, sweetie. We're just exploring options that might make her happier." Tyler looked directly at me then, his 12-year-old wisdom seeing straight through their careful euphemisms. "Do you want to go somewhere else, Grandma?" I knelt down to his eye level, taking his hands in mine. "Tyler, I want to be wherever I'm valued and respected and loved for who I am, not just for what I can provide. Right now, I'm not sure where that place is, but I'm going to find it." When I stood up, something had changed in the room's dynamic. For the first time in years, I held the power to make choices about my own life, and everyone present understood that the old patterns of assumption and exploitation had ended permanently. That night, I did something I hadn't done in decades. I prayed not for others, but for myself. Not for forgiveness or patience or the strength to endure, but for wisdom and courage and the continued blessing of knowing my own worth. And for the first time in years, I felt like God was listening. The breaking point came on a Sunday morning that dawned gray and cold, with November wind rattling the windows like an impatient visitor demanding entry. I had dressed for church in my best outfit, the burgundy dress I'd worn to Tyler's school awards ceremony, paired with the pearl necklace that had belonged to my mother. I felt armored in dignity, prepared for whatever battle this day might bring. But I wasn't prepared for the ambush waiting in the living room. Benjamin sat in the leather armchair that had once been Michael's favorite spot, his posture rigid with the false authority of a man who'd convinced himself that difficult decisions were noble ones. April perched on the edge of the sofa, her hands folded in her lap, but her eyes bright with anticipation. Between them, spread across the coffee table like evidence in a trial, were glossy brochures for senior living facilities. "Mom," Benjamin said as I paused in the doorway, "we need to talk. Really talk this time." Tyler was nowhere to be seen, and I understood that they'd deliberately chosen this moment when he was at his friend's house for a sleepover. Whatever they planned to say, they didn't want witnesses. "I'm on my way to church," I said calmly, adjusting my purse strap across my shoulder. "We can talk when I return." "No." April's voice carried a sharpness I'd rarely heard directed at me so openly. "We've been patient with your adjustment period, but this situation has gone on long enough." I entered the room fully then, taking a seat across from them with the measured composure of someone who'd learned not to react defensively to manipulation. "What situation is that, April?" Benjamin leaned forward, his expression a careful blend of concern and condescension. "Mom, you're 73 years old. You're making irrational decisions about your finances. You're becoming increasingly isolated and antisocial, and frankly, we're worried about your mental state." The accusation hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. Mental state. The ultimate weapon used against older women who dared to assert their independence. The suggestion that any deviation from compliant gratitude must indicate cognitive decline. "I see," I said, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "And what evidence do you have for this assessment of my mental state?" April gestured toward the brochures as if they constituted proof. "Margaret, you've completely disrupted our family's financial stability with no warning and no consideration for how your actions affect Tyler's future. That's not the behavior of someone thinking clearly." "Actually," I said, picking up one of the brochures and examining it with the detached interest I might show a restaurant menu, "withdrawing my financial support from adults who were treating me poorly while planning to abandon me seems like exactly the kind of clear thinking you should have expected from someone with my education and life experience." Benjamin's face flushed red. "We weren't planning to abandon you. We were trying to help you transition to a living situation that would be better suited to your needs." "My needs?" I set down the brochure and looked directly at my son. This man I'd raised to be better than this. "Benjamin, in the 2 years I've lived in this house, have you ever once asked me what my needs were? Have you ever inquired about my health, my happiness, my goals for my remaining years? Or have you simply assumed that my needs were irrelevant as long as my bank account remained accessible?" The silence stretched between us, filled with truths none of us had spoken aloud before this moment. "That's not fair," April said finally. "We've provided you with a comfortable home, family companionship, involvement in Tyler's life. You've provided me with a guest room in a house I helped you afford, conditional acceptance based on my continued financial contributions, and access to my grandson, as long as I didn't interfere with your parenting decisions or cost you money in babysitting fees." "God damn it, Mom!" Benjamin exploded, his carefully constructed composure finally cracking. "We've given you everything. A roof over your head, family meals, inclusion in our lives. What more do you want?" I stood up then, my 73-year-old frame suddenly feeling stronger than it had in years. "I want to be treated like a person instead of a problem. I want my contributions to be acknowledged instead of taken for granted. I want my opinions to matter and my presence to be valued for more than just my ability to write checks and provide free domestic labor." "You're being unreasonable," April said, her mask of false concern finally slipping to reveal the calculation underneath. "We've bent over backward to accommodate your quirks, your constant church attendance, your old-fashioned cooking, your need to give Tyler money behind our backs. We've tolerated all of it because you're family." Tolerated. I repeated the word like a diagnosis. "Yes, I can see how my presence has been such a burden for you. Living in a house I helped you buy, sending your son to a school I paid for, enjoying the financial security I provided while complaining about my quirks." Benjamin stood as well, towering over me with the physical intimidation that men learn to use when their arguments failed. "This conversation is over. We've made our decision. There's a very nice facility called Sunset Manor about 20 minutes from here. They have an opening available at the beginning of December, and we've already put down a deposit." The words hit me like physical blows, but I didn't flinch. Instead, I felt something crystallize inside me, hard and unbreakable as diamond. "I see," I said quietly. "And this decision was made when? Before or after you realized you couldn't pay your mortgage without my help?" "This has nothing to do with money," April protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "Everything in this house has to do with money, April. My money. The money that bought your marble countertops and paid for Tyler's education and kept you afloat when Benjamin's commissions fell short. The money you've gotten so comfortable spending that you forgot it belonged to someone whose opinions might matter." I walked to the mantelpiece where Tyler's school pictures sat in silver frames I'd given them for Christmas. Beside them was a small wooden cross I'd hung there during my first week in this house, back when I'd thought we were building something together. "You want to know what I've decided?" I said, turning back to face them. "I've decided that you're right. It is time for me to move out of this house." Relief flooded their faces so obviously that it would have been comical if it hadn't been so devastating. "But not to Sunset Manor," I continued. "I'm moving to my own apartment. One that I'll choose, in a neighborhood I like, surrounded by people who value my company instead of simply tolerating my presence." "Mom, be reasonable," Benjamin said, his relief already shifting to concern as he realized this wasn't going according to their script. "You can't live alone at your age. What if you fall? What if you get sick? What if I live my remaining years with dignity and independence instead of as a charity case in my own son's home?" I interrupted. "What if I discover that being 73 doesn't mean being helpless? What if I find out that I'm actually much happier when I'm not walking on eggshells around people who see me as a burden?" April's composure cracked completely. "You can't just leave. What about Tyler? What about your responsibilities to this family?" "My responsibility to Tyler is to show him that women deserve respect regardless of their age, and that family love shouldn't come with conditions and expiration dates. As for my responsibilities to this family, I've fulfilled them beyond any reasonable expectation. Now it's time for me to remember my responsibilities to myself." I moved toward the stairs, intending to begin the process of reclaiming my belongings from the guest room that had never felt like home. "Wait," Benjamin called after me, panic creeping into his voice. "We can work this out. Maybe we were hasty about the assisted living thing. Maybe we can find a different arrangement." I paused at the bottom of the staircase, looking back at these two people who'd shared my home for 2 years without ever really seeing me. "Benjamin, do you remember when you were 8 years old and you asked me why Daddy had to die?" He nodded, confusion replacing his panic. "I told you that sometimes God calls his most precious children home early because he has special work for them to do in heaven. Do you remember what you said?" "No." "You said, 'But Mommy, if Daddy was so precious, why didn't God take better care of him while he was here?'" It was such a wise question from such a little boy, and now I'm asking myself the same thing about my own life. If I'm precious to this family, why haven't you taken better care of me while I'm here? The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, marking seconds that felt like hours. "I forgive you both," I said finally, my voice carrying the weight of years of accumulated hurt and disappointment. "I forgive you for taking my love for granted, for treating my generosity as an entitlement, for planning my future without including me in the conversation. But forgiveness doesn't mean I have to continue enabling behavior that diminishes my dignity and disrespects my worth." I climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling like a small victory. Behind me, I heard April's voice, high and strained. "She can't do this to us. We have a mortgage payment due next week." And Benjamin's response, weary and defeated, "I think she just did." In my room, I sat on the edge of the bed I'd slept in for 2 years and opened my Bible to Jeremiah 29:11. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope." A future and a hope. At 73, I was finally ready to claim both. The apartment hunting began that afternoon. Patricia Williams had given me the name of a real estate agent who specialized in helping older adults find appropriate housing, and I scheduled appointments to see 3 different properties before the end of the week. The first was a senior living community similar to the ones Benjamin and April had selected for me. All services included, structured activities, and the subtle message that independence was something to be managed rather than celebrated. The second was a traditional apartment in a building full of young professionals who probably wouldn't appreciate a neighbor who prayed the rosary out loud or hummed hymns while cooking. But the third was perfect. A 2-bedroom apartment in a converted brownstone near St. Mary's, with original hardwood floors, tall windows that let in streams of golden light, and a kitchen large enough for the kind of cooking I'd been missing. The building housed a mix of ages and backgrounds, with neighbors who smiled when they passed in the hallway, and a landlord who seemed more interested in finding responsible tenants than managing every aspect of their lives. "I'll take it," I told the real estate agent before we'd even finished the tour. "Don't you want to think about it? Discuss it with your family?" I looked out the living room window toward the church spires visible in the distance, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: excitement about my future. "My family will have to adjust to my decisions instead of the other way around," I said, "and I've never been more certain about anything in my life." That evening, I broke the news to Tyler first, finding him in his room working on a science project about weather patterns. "Grandma's getting her own apartment," I told him gently, "but that doesn't mean I'm leaving you. It just means I'm choosing where I want to live instead of letting other people choose for me." He looked up from his poster board, his young face serious. "Will I still be able to visit you?" "Every weekend if your parents allow it. And holidays. And any time you need a grandma who thinks you're the most wonderful boy in the world." "Good," he said, returning to his project. "Their apartments probably have better cookies anyway." Out of the mouths of babes indeed. When Benjamin and April learned about my apartment, their reactions revealed everything I needed to know about their true priorities. Not once did they ask if I'd be happy there, if the neighborhood was safe, if I'd found a place that suited my needs. Their questions were all financial. How much rent would I be paying? Whether I'd still be available to help with emergencies? If my moving out would affect Tyler's schooling or their household budget? I answered each question with the patience of someone who'd finally learned to recognize manipulation for what it was. "Tyler's education is your responsibility, not mine. My rent is well within my budget, and my availability for emergencies will depend on whether those emergencies are genuine crises or simply inconveniences you'd prefer not to handle yourselves." December 1st couldn't come soon enough. Moving day arrived with the crisp clarity of a Chicago winter morning, the kind of day where every breath feels like a small act of faith and the sunlight seems to promise new beginnings. I stood in the guest room that had been my home for 2 years, surrounded by boxes that contained not just my possessions, but the remnants of a life I was choosing to transform. Helen Rodriguez had volunteered to help with the move, arriving at 8 in the morning with her daughter's pickup truck and the kind of practical kindness that makes miracles possible. She found me in the kitchen, wrapping my mother's china in newspaper. The same dishes I'd been forbidden to use for family dinners because they weren't modern enough for Benjamin and April's aesthetic. "Are you ready for this adventure?" Helen asked. studying my face for any signs of second thoughts or lingering doubt. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life," I said, and meant it completely. The truth was, I felt like a woman being released from a prison I'd helped build with my own misguided generosity. Every item I packed represented a small reclamation of my identity. The rosary my mother had given me for my first communion. The cookbook filled with recipes that had fed 3 generations of my family. The photo albums that chronicled a life of love and sacrifice that finally deserved to be honored rather than merely tolerated. Benjamin and April had made themselves scarce, disappearing early with Tyler for what they claimed was a previously scheduled outing, but which I recognized as their way of avoiding the discomfort of witnessing my departure. They'd left a note on the kitchen counter. Not a farewell or an expression of regret, but a reminder that I still had their spare key and instructions about where to leave it when I finished collecting my things. Even in my liberation, they couldn't resist treating me like a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected. Tyler, however, had insisted on saying goodbye properly. He'd appeared at my bedroom door the night before, carrying a handmade card that featured a drawing of the 2 of us standing in front of a house with an unusually large garden. "Grandma," he'd said with the solemnity that 12-year-olds reserve for life's most important moments. "I drew this for your new apartment. That's you and me, and I made the garden big because I know you like flowers." I'd hugged him then, breathing in the scent of his shampoo and the lingering sweetness of childhood, knowing that this boy would always carry a piece of my heart no matter where life took either of us. "Tyler, I want you to remember something," I'd told him, holding his face in my hands so he could see the truth in my eyes. "Sometimes adults have to make difficult choices to take care of themselves. That doesn't mean they love you any less. It just means they've learned that they can't take care of others properly if they don't take care of themselves first." He'd nodded with understanding that seemed far beyond his years, then whispered, "Are you going to be happier now, Grandma?" "I think I am, sweetheart. I think I'm going to remember how to be happy." Now, as Helen and I loaded the last box into the truck, I felt that happiness beginning to take root in the fertile soil of my newfound independence. The apartment that awaited me wasn't just a change of address. It was a return to myself, a chance to remember who Margaret Rose Thompson was when she wasn't busy being everyone else's solution to their problems. The drive to my new home took us through neighborhoods I'd forgotten existed, past coffee shops and bookstores and community gardens that spoke of life being lived deliberately rather than simply endured. When we pulled up in front of the brownstone that would be my sanctuary, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The pure joy of coming home to a place that was entirely my own. Mrs. Chen, my new landlord, met us at the front door with keys and a welcome basket filled with homemade cookies and a small potted orchid. She was a woman about my age, with silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun and eyes that held the kindness of someone who understood that moving day represented more than just a change of location. "Mrs. Thompson," she said, handing me the keys with a ceremony that felt almost sacred. "Welcome to your new home. I have a feeling you're going to be very happy here." The apartment was even more beautiful than I'd remembered. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting golden rectangles across the hardwood floors that would soon hold my furniture, my books, my life arranged according to my own preferences rather than someone else's requirements. The kitchen, though smaller than the one I'd left behind, felt infinitely more welcoming, because it would serve only people who wanted to be there. Helen helped me unpack with the efficiency of someone who understood that creating a home was both art and science. We hung my mother's crucifix in the living room where everyone could see it, placed my father's old leather chair by the window where the afternoon light would be perfect for reading, and arranged my books on the built-in shelves with the care of curators preparing an exhibit. "This feels like you," Helen said as we stepped back to admire our work. "It feels like the woman I met at church, not the woman who was disappearing into other people's expectations." That evening, I did something I hadn't done in over 2 years. I cooked dinner for myself, not a meal designed to please other people's preferences or accommodate their dietary restrictions, but the simple comfort food that had nourished my soul for decades. Pot roast with carrots and potatoes, the recipe my mother had taught me when I was barely tall enough to reach the stove. As the familiar aromas filled my kitchen, I felt something shift inside me. Not just contentment, but genuine peace. I was exactly where I belonged, doing exactly what brought me joy, answerable to no one but myself and the God who had carried me through every storm of my life. I ate dinner at my small kitchen table with my Bible open beside my plate, reading the words of Psalm 23 that had sustained me through widowhood and single motherhood and the long journey back to self-respect. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Paths of righteousness. For so many years, I'd believed that righteousness meant endless self-sacrifice, putting everyone else's needs before my own, enabling poor behavior in the name of Christian love, but sitting in my own space, eating food I'd prepared for my own pleasure. I understood that true righteousness sometimes requires us to value ourselves enough to demand better treatment. The first week in my new apartment passed like a beautiful dream. I woke each morning to sunlight streaming through my bedroom windows, no one rushing me to prepare breakfast or demanding that I adjust my schedule to accommodate their needs. I attended daily mass at St. Mary's, where Father Martinez welcomed me back with the warmth of someone who'd missed my presence in the congregation. "Margaret," he said after Wednesday morning service, "you look radiant. There's a peace about you that wasn't there before." "I've learned something important, Father," I replied. "I've learned that God doesn't call us to accept poor treatment in the name of humility. Sometimes the most Christian thing we can do is love ourselves enough to demand respect." He smiled with the wisdom of someone who'd watched too many parishioners sacrifice their dignity on the altar of misguided martyrdom. Some of the strongest women I know have learned that lesson, usually later in life than they should have. I'm glad you found your way to it. On Friday evening, my doorbell rang with the first visitor to my new home. Tyler stood in the hallway, slightly out of breath from climbing the stairs, carrying a small bouquet of flowers he'd clearly chosen himself. "Mom and Dad are downstairs," he said, handing me the flowers with the shy pride of someone giving a gift chosen with great care. "They wanted to see your apartment." I looked past him toward the stairwell, where I could hear Benjamin and April's voices floating up from the landing below. They'd come, I realized, not out of affection or curiosity about my well-being, but because Tyler had insisted, and they'd been unable to find a reasonable excuse to refuse him. "Well then," I said, opening my door wider, "I suppose they should come up." Benjamin and April climbed the stairs with the reluctant air of people fulfilling an unwelcome obligation. When they entered my living room, I watched their faces carefully, looking for any sign of recognition that I'd created something beautiful, something that reflected who I actually was rather than who they'd needed me to be. What I saw instead was surprise. Not pleasant surprise, but the uncomfortable shock of people discovering that someone they'd underestimated was far more capable than they'd assumed. "It's nice," April said, her voice carrying the particular tone people use when they mean something quite different from what they're saying. "Very quaint." "It's perfect," Tyler announced, throwing himself onto my father's old chair with the casual ownership of a child who felt immediately at home. "It smells like cookies and books and Grandma." Benjamin walked to the window that looked out onto the tree-lined street, his expression unreadable. "Mom, are you sure you can manage here? The stairs, the neighborhood." "Benjamin, I managed to raise you in far more challenging circumstances than these. I think I can handle a second-floor apartment in one of Chicago's safest neighborhoods." We had coffee and the cookies Mrs. Chen had given me, conversation stilted but civil. April commented on my furniture arrangements with the forced politeness of someone fulfilling social obligations. Benjamin asked practical questions about my lease terms and utility costs. Tyler explored every corner of the apartment with the enthusiasm of someone discovering a new world. But the real conversation happened when Tyler excused himself to use the bathroom, and Benjamin and April found themselves alone with me for the first time since moving day. "Mom," Benjamin said, setting down his coffee cup with the careful precision of someone preparing to address difficult topics, "we've been thinking about what happened. About the things that were said. Have you? We want you to know that the door is always open. If this experiment doesn't work out, if you find that living alone is more difficult than you expected, you're always welcome to come home." Home. The word carried assumptions that I was no longer willing to accept. "Benjamin, this is my home now. This apartment, this neighborhood, this life that I've chosen for myself. What I had with you was accommodation, not a home. April's composure cracked slightly. Margaret, we provided you with a comfortable living situation, family connections, security. You provided me with a guest room in exchange for financial contributions and domestic labor, then made plans to dispose of me when I became inconvenient. That's not security, April. That's exploitation with better marketing. The silence that followed was broken by Tyler's return, his young presence immediately lightening the atmosphere of adult tension and unspoken resentments. When they left an hour later, Tyler lingered in my doorway for an extra hug and a whispered promise to call me soon. Benjamin and April departed with the stiff courtesy of people who'd discovered that their former tenant had transformed into someone they couldn't control or manipulate. As I watched their car disappear down the street, I felt no satisfaction in their discomfort, no triumph in their obvious frustration with my independence. Instead, I felt the deep peace that comes from finally living in alignment with your own values, from choosing dignity over convenience, from remembering that love shouldn't require you to diminish yourself. That night, I knelt beside my bed for evening prayers as I had every night for 70 years. But for the first time in recent memory, my prayers were filled with gratitude rather than requests for patience and strength to endure. Thank you, Lord, I whispered, for giving me the courage to choose myself. Thank you for showing me that being a good Christian doesn't mean accepting poor treatment. Thank you for reminding me that I am your daughter, worthy of love and respect, and the chance to live my remaining years with joy. Outside my window, the city hummed with life. Thousands of people making their own choices, pursuing their own dreams, creating their own definitions of home and family and happiness. I was one of them now, no longer existing on the margins of other people's lives, but firmly planted in the center of my own. At 73, I was finally learning how to bloom. 6 months later, I stood in my kitchen preparing Sunday dinner for a gathering that would have been impossible to imagine during my darkest days in Benjamin's house. The table was set for 5, myself, Helen Rodriguez, Mrs. Chen from downstairs, Father Martinez, and Tyler, who now spent every other weekend with me by mutual agreement rather than desperate necessity. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had unfolded gradually, like a flower reaching toward sunlight after years in shadow, each day bringing small revelations about who I was when I wasn't busy managing other people's emotions or subsidizing their poor choices. The woman who now hummed hymns while kneading bread for Sunday dinner bore little resemblance to the silent, diminished figure who had once sat in a guest room wondering if her life still had any purpose beyond serving ungrateful family members. That woman had been disappearing by degrees, fading into the wallpaper of other people's lives, until she'd almost forgotten she had substance and color of her own. This woman, this Margaret Rose Thompson who chose her own schedule, decorated her own space, and spent her money on causes and people who valued her contributions. This woman was vibrant with the particular joy that comes from living authentically. The doorbell rang as I was taking the roast from the oven, and I opened it to find Tyler carrying a bouquet of daffodils and wearing the kind of smile that reminded me why grandmotherhood was one of God's greatest gifts to women brave enough to age gracefully. "Grandma," he said, launching himself into my arms with the uncomplicated affection of a child who'd learned that love didn't have to be earned through financial contributions or domestic servitude. "Dad dropped me off early because he said you probably needed help with dinner preparation." I smiled at that, recognizing Benjamin's assumption that I was struggling with the basic tasks of independent living. The truth was quite different. I was thriving in ways that apparently made my son and daughter-in-law uncomfortable, challenging their narrative that I'd needed their protection and guidance rather than simply their respect. "How are things at home, sweetheart?" I asked as Tyler hung his jacket in the closet and immediately made himself comfortable in the kitchen. "Different," he said with the diplomatic wisdom of a child navigating complex adult dynamics. "Mom and Dad argue more about money now, and they had to cancel our summer vacation because they couldn't afford it without your help." I felt a pang of sympathy for Tyler, caught in the middle of consequences he hadn't created, but I also recognized that children benefit from understanding that choices have results, that financial irresponsibility eventually demands accountability. "I'm sorry they're arguing, Tyler. That must be difficult for you. It's okay, he said with a maturity that broke my heart a little. I told them that maybe we could have a staycation this year and explore Chicago instead. There's lots of free stuff to do here. Out of the mouths of babes. This 12-year-old had already learned lessons about contentment and resourcefulness that his parents were still struggling to accept. My other guests arrived in quick succession, each bringing something to contribute to our meal and our conversation. Helen brought homemade rolls and updates from the church bulletin about members who needed prayers. Mrs. Chen contributed a beautiful fruit salad and stories about her garden that was already showing signs of spring growth. Father Martinez arrived with communion wine and the kind of gentle wisdom that made him everyone's favorite dinner companion. As we gathered around my table, the same table that had been relegated to a basement storage area at Benjamin's house because it wasn't sophisticated enough for their dinner parties, I felt overwhelmed by gratitude for the community I'd discovered in my independence. "Father," I said as we joined hands for grace, "would you lead us in prayer?" "Actually, Margaret," he said with a smile that suggested he'd been hoping for this opportunity, "I was wondering if you'd do the honors today. You've been quite an inspiration to our parish lately, and I think your perspective on God's faithfulness would be particularly meaningful." I bowed my head, feeling the warm pressure of Tyler's small hand in mine and Helen's firm grip on the other side, and spoke from a heart that had learned to recognize miracles in the most unexpected places. "Heavenly Father, we thank you for this meal, for this table, and for the people gathered around it who've taught me that family isn't just about blood relations, but about the bonds we choose to honor and nurture. Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to reclaim our dignity, to remember our worth, and to insist on being treated with the love and respect that all your children deserve." I paused, thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment of peace and purpose. Thank you for the courage to say no when saying yes was diminishing my spirit. Thank you for the wisdom to understand that true love sometimes requires boundaries, and that enabling poor behavior isn't the same as showing grace. Thank you for Tyler, who reminds me every day that love given freely is infinitely more beautiful than love extracted through guilt or obligation. And thank you, Lord, for teaching me that miracles aren't always dramatic interventions from heaven. Sometimes they're simply the quiet transformation that happens when we finally learn to value ourselves the way you've always valued us. Amen. The chorus of amens that followed felt like a benediction on the life I'd chosen to build. Dinner conversation flowed easily among people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Tyler told us about his science fair project on renewable energy, clearly excited about knowledge for its own sake rather than performance for adults' approval. Helen shared updates about her daughter, whose relationship with her had grown stronger since Helen had established clear boundaries about respect and reciprocity. Mrs. Chen described her plans for expanding the community garden behind our building, asking if I'd be interested in maintaining a small plot for vegetables and herbs. Father Martinez discussed the parish's new program for supporting older adults who wanted to remain independent in their own homes, rather than being pressured into institutional care they didn't need or want. As the afternoon wore on, I realized that this table represented something I'd never experienced in Benjamin's house. Mutual affection without obligation, conversation without agenda, the simple pleasure of sharing food and time with people who saw me as Margaret Rose Thompson rather than someone's mother, someone's burden, someone's solution to their financial problems. Around 4 o'clock, the doorbell rang again. I wasn't expecting anyone else, and Tyler looked confused as well. When I opened the door, I found Benjamin and April standing in the hallway, their expressions a mixture of discomfort and determination. "We were in the neighborhood," Benjamin said, though we all knew this wasn't true. "We thought we'd stop by to see how you're doing." I invited them in, of course, though I could see immediately that my dinner party made them uncomfortable. Here was evidence that I'd built a social life without their permission or assistance, that I was thriving in circumstances they'd predicted would overwhelm me. "Tyler, we came to pick you up early," April said, her voice carrying the strained cheerfulness of someone performing for an audience. "We thought we could spend some family time together this afternoon." Tyler looked from his parents to me to the table where our guests were finishing dessert and coffee, clearly reluctant to leave but uncertain about how to express his preference without causing conflict. "Actually," I said, recognizing an opportunity to model the kind of grace that comes from strength rather than weakness. We were just finishing dinner. Tyler's welcome to stay as long as he'd like, but I understand if you need him to come with you. Benjamin surveyed my living room, taking in the evidence of my contentment. The books scattered on the coffee table, the plants thriving in the sunny windows, the photographs of Tyler and me that documented our growing relationship as grandmother and grandson rather than caretaker and dependent. "You seem settled," he said, and something in his voice suggested this wasn't entirely positive observation. "I am very settled, very happy." "Mom," he said, lowering his voice as if privacy could somehow make his next words more acceptable. "I want you to know that if this independence experiment ever becomes too much for you, if you ever need help or support, you can always—" "Benjamin," I interrupted gently, "thank you for the offer, but I need you to understand something. This isn't an experiment. This is my life. The life I chose after learning to value myself enough to demand better treatment than I was receiving." April's composure cracked slightly. "Margaret, we've apologized for any misunderstandings. We've acknowledged that perhaps we could have been more considerate of your feelings. But this estrangement isn't healthy for anyone, especially Tyler." I looked at my grandson, who was listening to this conversation with the careful attention of a child trying to understand the adult world's complex politics. "Tyler," I said, addressing him directly, "do you feel like our relationship has suffered since I moved to my own apartment?" "No," he said immediately. "I think it's gotten better. We get to do fun stuff together now, and you always have time to listen to me, and you don't seem sad anymore." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken truths and uncomfortable realizations. "I think," I said carefully, "that what Tyler is observing is the difference between a relationship based on genuine affection and one based on obligation and convenience. Since I moved out, he and I have spent time together because we both wanted to, not because I was available to provide free childcare or because guilt demanded it." Father Martinez, Helen, and Mrs. Chen had tactfully retreated to the kitchen, giving our family privacy while remaining close enough to provide support if needed. I was grateful for their presence, for the reminder that I wasn't alone in navigating these complex emotional waters. "What do you want from us, Mom?" Benjamin asked, and for the first time in months, his voice carried genuine vulnerability rather than calculated manipulation. "I want exactly what I have now," I said. "Respect for my choices, acknowledgement of my independence, and relationships based on mutual affection rather than financial convenience. I want to be Tyler's grandmother, not his babysitter. I want to be your mother, not your safety net. I want to be appreciated for who I am, not just for what I can provide. And if we can't give you that, then we'll have the relationship we currently have, polite, distant, and limited to Tyler's visits and holiday obligations. But Benjamin, I want you to understand that I'm not the one who chose this distance. I simply stopped enabling the disrespect that made distance inevitable." They left shortly after that, taking Tyler with them, but leaving behind the unmistakable sense that our relationship had shifted onto new ground where I held equal footing rather than occupying the subordinate position I'd accepted for too long. As I cleaned up from dinner with my chosen family's help, Helen asked the question I'd been pondering myself. "Do you think they'll ever understand what you've tried to teach them?" "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I've learned that my peace doesn't depend on their understanding. It depends on my willingness to live according to my own values rather than their expectations." That evening, as I sat in my father's chair reading my Bible by the light of the lamp Tyler had helped me choose, I reflected on the miraculous nature of transformation that happens not through dramatic interventions, but through the accumulation of small, brave choices. The woman who had once believed that love required endless self-sacrifice had learned that true love, including love for oneself, sometimes demands boundaries, standards, and the courage to walk away from situations that diminish our souls. I thought about Benjamin's video message that had started this journey, his casual dismissal of my faith and his reduction of my life to furniture. "Miracles are for fools," he'd said, never imagining that his mother would become living proof that miracles are for anyone brave enough to believe they deserve better. The miracle hadn't been a single moment of divine intervention. It had been the gradual awakening of a woman who'd forgotten her own worth, the steady reclamation of dignity that had been eroded by years of taking love for granted, the quiet revolution that happens when someone finally learns to say no to treatment that doesn't honor their fundamental humanity. At 73, I had discovered that it's never too late to choose yourself, never too late to demand respect, never too late to remember that you are beloved by God and deserving of love that doesn't come with conditions or expiration dates. As I closed my Bible and prepared for bed in the apartment I'd chosen, surrounded by the life I'd built according to my own values and preferences, I whispered one final prayer of gratitude for the miracle of second chances and the courage to claim them. Have you ever lived through something like this? Or do you know someone who has found strength through faith during a difficult family situation? How did prayer and trust in God help you or them through it? If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe to this channel so this message can reach someone who needs to hear it today. May God bless everyone who's been through something like this. In Jesus' name, Amen.